Hello, hello everybody, and welcome to our Summer of Love dialogue. AI just want to have fun. So I'm just seeing that participants are joining us, and so we should perhaps wait just a few seconds to allow everybody to join. And also, I need to disclose that I need to retrieve a couple of notes that I took to offer a proper presentation of our speakers today, whom I really want to thank. We have here Alfie Bown and Isabel Millar. Thank you very much for being here. And I think you can also see, because you're still on video, Nate. Thanks to Nate Trucat. He's the director of the Center for Digital Inquiry at Warwick, that is offering us the platform to experience this Summer of Love together. So the idea of the Summer of Love, the idea of the Summer of Love is an idea of mine, and it is because I am researching these topics. I am researching the topics of digital romance, digital love, and I wanted to basically create for myself the summer school, or the series of talks that no one was creating for me at the moment in which I wanted. So I thought, okay, it's better to sort of do it yourself, and I just thought that it's nice to spend some time talking about love and eros, and while clubs are still shut, at least we can fantasize about these things, and we'll do it digitally, which there is a degree of consistency between the message and the medium, so to speak. And yes, so today we are talking about artificial intelligence, big data, sex, desire, hope, and other things that I don't know, because actually I'm really looking forward and excited with anticipation for today's dialogue. In the first part of the dialogue, you'll have Alfie and Isabel, our speakers. Thanks again for being with us today, presenting their current research and their findings, the ideas that they want to share with us. And then in the second part, I will invite you all, like people from the audience, to please intervene, ask questions, make comments, talk about your research if it relates to ours, and make it a space for dialogue. So in a ideal world, I really would like this space to be a space for debate and exchange and sharing. So let me present our speakers. Alfie Bown is at the Royal Holloway University of London, and one of his books, which is called Enjoy It, Candy Crush Capitalism, played a big role in how I articulated my ideas about capitalism and desire, capitalism and enjoyment. In an article that I co-authored with Arturo Bandinelli, we used a lot, we quote a lot, because and so hence why I wanted to invite you today, because I think that your take and the ways it connects how we relate to technologies and how sort of capitalism hook our desire and ability to enjoy is quite illuminating. Alfie is not only a scholar, but is also one of those public intellectuals that have his YouTube channels and podcast series. He writes for The Guardian, for the Paris Review. So it's one of these people that are really able to communicate across a wide range of audiences. So thank you very much for being here. And I also know that you're working on a forthcoming book. And do you want to say something about it, perhaps? I think it has something to do with what you'll talk about today.
Yeah, no, I said that is probably the most generous introduction I've ever had by miles, Carolina. And also, I've quoted your, I've actually quoted your article back. So there's a sort of weird cycle there.
One citation for us.
Yeah, and that is in my new book. Yeah, I just finished this book about the topic of this talk really, or this discussion. So basically about the way in which the love industry, what I think of as the love industry, has been kind of gamified and transformed through apps, through data, through video game or gamification and so on, which I'll be talking about today. But yeah, that will all be part of a new book that's coming out in, like, I think in 6 months or something.
And speaking of new books, Isabel has just published her new books that draws from her PhD, and she's one of the scholars that amongst those that I know, whose monograph has come in the quickest possible way. Like, as far as I understand, like, you submitted your thesis and then there was the monograph already there. And for someone that took a year of pain and a weird form of, necrophilia in going in the thesis and open it and seeing what parts to use, this really, you have my utmost admiration and also a bit of suspicious, like, how did you do? Like, what's your secret?
I'll never tell.
Yes, no, if I were you, I wouldn't tell. But I'll try to develop, to mobilize some intel and understand. But so your book, perhaps you want to say something about your book. It is about psychoanalysis, ethics and technology. And one of the reasons why I wanted you to come today is because I think that the question of ethics is a very important question. And I think that when we talk about how we relate to technology, how we are affected by new technologies, if we really are to take seriously what some call the post-human, I know that between the post-human people and the psychoanalysis people, there's a bit of frictions. But anyway, if we are to take seriously the fact that technologies are so much embedded in how we live, how we feel, our experiences, etc., then I think we cannot proceed from the question of ethics, as a way also to sort of inspire or guide, I don't know, this sort of relationship that is going to become increasingly important. But perhaps, Isabel, do you want to say something about this book of yours? I know that I guess you'll talk about it later on, but.
Yeah, I will talk about it actually. So just to say that it's called The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, and it, as you say, was the result of my PhD. And I'll be talking a bit about it, a lot about it, in fact, after Alfie's introduced his.
That's great. I'm looking forward to hear it. And you did your PhD in Kingston, and now you are at the University of Kent. Is that correct?
Well, I'm a research fellow, but I'm not at University of Kent. So I'm literally, I'm just, the print is drying on my PhD, so I've barely sort of. So yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay. So I'm Carolina Bandinelli, and I am at the University of Warwick. I think I've already said something about myself and why I've organized this series. So without further ado, Alfie, do you want to start?
So nice to be here, and thanks everyone for coming as well. I guess I'll just talk for 15 minutes, a bit informally about my research and some kind of key areas that I think are of interest. And also, I just finished Isabel's brilliant book, and I'm looking forward to hearing and talking about that as well. So much there to think about. And I guess, like, for me, I mean, I did my degree, my studies really all in literature and in philosophy and critical theory and psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis has always been the kind of main thing for me. But it was only around 2014 when I was in Hong Kong at that time, struggling for a job over here. when the Gamergate saga happened around video games and politics, basically. And I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, probably it's very familiar to most people, even interested in digital culture and stuff. But, you know, it's basically this kind of massive mobilization of various political groups from the darkest corners and less dark corners of the internet, who kind of hounded and attacked a variety of well, anyone who represented the video games industry becoming diversified in any way. And this kind of like flared up this massive politics of games, video games suddenly being seen as this deeply political thing, which they had always historically been detached from politics in discourse, and they generally still are detached from politics in the media. So at that point, I switched from working on, I guess, critical theory into what you'd call media studies, I guess, and started to think about how psychoanalysis and other kinds of theory might help us deal with this kind of moment where digital culture, and in particular at that time games, had suddenly become this incredibly important political force. And that obviously led into their strange relationship with the Trump election and all this kind of mad stuff that was going on around the time, race relations as well, all embedded in this kind of games culture war. And so at that point, I started to kind of, thinking about psychoanalysis as a tool to understand the relationship between technology and politics, I suppose. The way that that's sort of gone for me is now thinking, because the key to the value of psychoanalysis, in my opinion, is basically the question of desire. So that could be, you know, thought of as very much in the Summer of Love sort of way, directly applying to our desires, our instincts, our feelings, emotions, and so on. But psychoanalysis as the thing which kind of politicizes that was the kind of important thing for me. And interestingly, I mean, it's although sort of both Freud and later Lacan often make these points about how desire must be seen in this intensely political way, psychoanalysis has a reputation of almost the opposite, really, of sort of almost separating, let's say, love from the world of politics. You know, it's actually not the case, really. And you know, Freud, in, I think, group psychology, it is the, what is it called? Group psychology and analysis of the ego. He refers to eros as the force which holds together everything in the world. And I mean, I find this incredibly important quote, and it's obviously got its context in thinking about how people react and think and feel in groups. But the point that Freud's making is not the old one that many people associate with psychoanalysis, that if we can understand desire, or if we can understand love or instinct, I know these are different things, but then we can understand everything else. So, you know, there's a kind of cliched psychoanalysis, you know, think of any Woody Allen film, where basically all of culture happens on the top, politics happens on the top, and then underneath that, if you look deep, you find that the ultimate cause, or the ultimate sort of driving force of society is sexual. That's, I guess, the cliche, or it has to do with desire or impulse or even love. But I think this is, in fact, actually the opposite is true in Freud's formulation of that, and certainly in Lacan's work on it too, because what Freud is saying actually is that love, or eros, contains all of politics inside it. So in other words, for us to think and feel things, there has to be already this kind of important political structure in place, and for a moment of desire to exist. And like every, I guess the point would be this: every moment of desire kind of contains within it all of the surrounding politics of its context, of its moments, of its place in history, and so on. So whilst people think of psychoanalysis as something which is about how love, desire, impulse underlie politics, it's actually more like a discourse which is trying to explore how even our deepest feelings, I mean, these are a typical way of putting it, I guess, but even our deepest feelings, our most instinctive, drives are containing within them all kinds of external cultural and political forces and so on. And I guess one Lacanian way of describing this would be in the relationship between instinct and drive, where Lacan says that drive gives you a kick in the arse, whereas instinct comes from within. And the point is that there's hardly any instincts and loads of drives. So you often think that you're acting instinctually from within, but actually you're under the influence of a drive, which gives you a kick in the arse from outside, which is coming from society, politics, culture, or some other ideological force. But we as subjects experience these impulses as if they are internal or our own or unique or instinctual or whatever kind of formulation you want. So even your sort of deepest sexual desires, I suppose, contain within them all of the surrounding politics of the culture, time and place. So with that, that's the sort of theoretical kind of underpinning for the sort of perspective I take on these things. I'm going to sort of jump to talking about some kind of examples of, I think, how politics and desire are getting, how contemporary digital culture proves this point in a way that like Freud or even Lacan would never have dreamed, because we actually see this in such clear ways when we look at digital culture, the way that data, predictive algorithms, and even to a certain extent artificial intelligence are impinging and controlling the love industry, the economies of desire, the libidinal economies that we are experiencing today. So, I mean, I'll first talk about a few examples of things which I'd say are very specifically to do with love in the sense of relationships or sex. And then I'll talk about some more kind of abstract examples, I think, from digital culture where desire is implicated in different ways. Like even with something that I'm not going to talk about, like the Cambridge Analytica, the structure of Cambridge Analytica and the way they use data analytics to influence elections, I think that that is also something that is deeply at the level of desire and the relationship between desire and politics. So I'll come to those kind of more abstract things later, but just to give an example of sort of where my research goes with this is, well, it's not really research, is it? To be honest, it's writing. Yeah, so I mean, so start with like the kind of gamification of love, I guess would be the best way to put it. I mean, I guess the example, I mean, there's a few, but one of the examples like par excellence is Grindr. So this like amazing story about Grindr. Like Grindr is like material for like an entire book of its own. It's incredible what's happened with Grindr. Like, so for a long time, I don't know if people know that all of the dating sites that we're all on are owned by one company called Match Group, which is owned, well, until 2021 was owned by IAC, which is this enormous conglomerate in the US. It's got this extremely strange building in Manhattan looking across to New Jersey. It looks like a sort of, it looks a bit Star Trek, but it's very dystopian building, and it's dystopian what they're doing in there, let me tell you. Yeah, so basically this company, IAC, they own Tinder, Hinge, but they also own the traditional ones, the older ones, Plenty Fish, OkCupid, Match, whatever. They also own Christian Harmony, strange other kind of niche dating sites. And Grindr was the only one that was not really part of this this kind of dating economy of IAC, the Match Group. But in 2016, it started to get taken over by this like strange company, Beijing Kunlun Tech, who make a load of popular Chinese games on the app stores in WeChat and Tencent App Store. They're incredibly popular sort of, they make dating simulators, I find incredibly interesting, but they also make just sort of like merge games, things like, you know, like where you just like merge a dragon with another dragon and it becomes a larger green dragon or something like that. They also make this kind of gaming app, and they also make AR apps, so augmented reality stuff, basically design like things in the vein of Pokemon Go, I guess you could think of that. And they started this takeover of Grindr. First, this seemed quite strange, because why a gaming company would want to acquire, especially a gaming company in a country which doesn't respect LGBTQ plus rights, would try and acquire this kind of app from the US. But when like you start looking at the history of Grindr, it makes a lot more sense than you'd think. Grindr like is essentially the gamification of love, and in 2009 it starts, and basically it works by this location-based matching up. You know, I'm sure you can imagine this is old stuff that's again not dissimilar from something like Pokemon Go or Ingress. And the guy who's done the best work on it is this journalist called Evan Moffat, who's written about his experiences as a user of Grindr. And he basically found that since like basically 2007 or 8 or 2010, maybe around that time when it was really taking off, you know, people were attending sort of dates or alternatively sex parties or whatever else was organized through Grindr, and basically experiencing the whole thing while on their smartphone at the same time. So you would not actually disconnect from your smartphone. So, you know, this is, in a way, we could say Grindr is like pre-augmented reality, because you got this kind of desire economy, matching people with each other, dating, sex, whatever. And the phone is playing this kind of key role of kind of gamifying, and you can collect points. People are sharing through Grindr, through the interface with other people, and as they're going through these processes of dating, of desiring, of fucking, whatever, live, they're also experiencing it partly through the app itself at the same time of doing it. So if you sort of zoom out then to like 2016, when a games company tries to acquire this, you can actually see this like really important connection between like gamification and dating and love. And of course, an example, like, even, you know, we can see instinctively without any research, can't we, that something like Tinder is basically a kind of like structured like a card game, you know, and the kind of pleasure of swiping that is implicit to like 50% at least of the major dating apps. Is part of this process. But Grindr is the sort of star in that it shows this incredible connection between gamification and love, and other dating apps kind of follow suit, which is not a pun about card playing. Yeah, and then so what you see then is the gamification of dating, and then I start to think about like the politics of these things. And what you're basically seeing at the level of algorithm, I'm not going to like, you know, it took a long time actually to even get like OkCupid to like share what kinds of algorithm they use to match people. And I still don't fully know, but you can learn some things. And you can also try and like game them, which is quite fun. But you know, the point is that this process of taking love into this kind of gamified world actually has its own kind of politics. And I think to jump to another dating app, which proves the next point best, it's probably one none of you have used. It's a Chinese app called Baihei. And Baihei is important because it was the first app to integrate the like a social credit score into its algorithm for matching potential partners with each other. So what this app does is, you know, I mean, sure you saw in the media when like Beijing announced this kind of social credit system where you'd be rewarded for like being a good citizen or whatever, with some like in-game rewards or something. And then like New York Times was like, oh my God, it's dystopia in China. But obviously this stuff happens all the time. In fact, Transport for London are were beta testing an app for basically similar kind of things, where, you know, it's just like if there's congestion, you take a different route, you get in-game rewards and so on. So this is all like, it's all part of the smart city and how these things are being developed across the globe. It's not a particularly Chinese problem at all. But this app anyway, it's a Chinese app, and it basically matches people based on what's called a Zima credit score, which is it's Alibaba Group who created this kind of, it's a little bit like a credit check. Imagine like a credit check, which you'd expect to have in the UK for certain things like buying a house, whatever. I don't know, some people buy houses, but yeah, I heard you have to have one. I've never like got so economically successful as to actually need a credit check, but apparently people have them and are okay with it. But this is like that, but it adds these other features, and one of them is like friendships. So if you've got friendships who have a lower score, you can also your score will also be affected. And I think there's another category which is to do with like honesty. They call it honesty. But for instance, if you've got a Facebook profile with a different name to your Twitter account or something, that will count against you. And obviously I know that Facebook and Twitter are not part of that process in China, but the point is that if you have different accounts with different names, whatever, that counts as dishonesty or whatever, and you drop points on your score. So there's, you know, it's very much like Mark Zuckerberg's dream of having this kind of seamless one identity. You know, that's what Mark Zuckerberg said in 2010, that his ultimate aim was to make sure that everyone had only one identity. And what it does then is it uses this score so that you can match with better people. But what I mean by that is closer matches, the higher your score is. So what they're saying is the algorithm knows what you want, but it only gives it to you if you could succeed on XYZ social task, whatever. So then you can, and if you pass these criteria, you can then be rewarded with, you know, the dates that you I think that's like theoretically really mad, because it implies that it's not, the app is not doing its best. Yeah, the app is yeah, and it's not from Alibaba, but it's using the Zima credit score, Zima like that, which is an Alibaba credit score. So it's just it's a separate app. It's not affiliated with Alibaba, but the credit score comes from Alibaba. Anyway. I could talk about Alibaba for like days. I once went there in Hangzhou to Alibaba's Cloud Town, which is like their shit version of Silicon Valley. And I got taken on like this mad drive in a mad car, which I'd love talking about, but there's probably not time. So let me come back to this point about the politicization of these things. Essentially what Baihei does is it rewards, economically successful people, but also its own kind of social conformism score. So you conform to the idea, the model of a good citizen, and you succeed economically, and therefore love seems to is opened up to you or whatever. So I guess what my point here is, and there's not really time to sort of prove it in full, but my point here is that the gamification of love is happening, and it's not innocent. It's happening for political reasons, and our desires. If Freud is right that desire, eros, drive contains within it all of politics, then I think we are being totally transformed today into a different kind of desiring subject. It's like what Jean-Francois Lyotard called a desire revolution, where our desires are changing, and they are changing in very political ways. And obviously an example like Baihei shows how much capitalism and how much certain kinds of states conformism, I guess, would feed into that kind of politics that's transforming us on the level of desire. I suppose the other thing I'd like to say is that this stretches out of the world of love and into the world of data, I guess, and to a certain extent artificial intelligence. Or maybe for me, what I'm mostly interested in is predictive technology. I think that's probably the best way of describing my interest. It's predictive technology. So it can involve some kinds of AI, or what we think of as AI. It can be built on predictive technology, and data is part of it, because obviously this is the way in which we use data to predict and so on. And maybe I will, in fact, as a last point, mention this car. So I went to give a talk in Hangzhou about how WeChat was evil. So I was like slagging off Tencent, and after the talk, these two guys come up to me and said, "Oh, we're from Alibaba," and I thought, oh, I'm gonna need a lawyer or something here. Like I've got myself in trouble here. And they said, no, we love you. We love you. You hate Tencent. And I was like, yes, yeah, I do. And they were like, so you'll love us. You'll love us. We're Alibaba, And I was like, no, that's not how this works. I hate you both, And they thought that was funny. And anyway, they invited me to go to Silicon. It's called Cloud Town. It's this kind of really strange. I mean, Hangzhou is an incredible place because it's a really old town in East China, but it's also a trial run for this kind of what's called the city brain, Alibaba's kind of smart city. And so I asked this guy when we got there, he's taking me on this car, this things. I said to him, this car he was showing me, it's a project with Rover. This is actually a couple of years ago now, so this is kind of old stuff, but it's still like the driving force of my research in a lot of ways. It's made by Alibaba and Rover, the car manufacturer. And this like got a drone. The car's got a drone that follows it around. It has some self-driving features, although it's not entirely self-driving. Anyway, I asked the guy, like, what's the most important thing about this car? What are you so pleased with? Because the guy was glowing with pride of this car. And I was expecting him to say, like, it's fast, it looks good, it's safe, it drives itself. But he said, it knows what you want to eat and when you want to eat it before you do. And at first I thought, oh, God, that's just nonsense, and I didn't think about it. But later when I started thinking about it, I realized this actually is the most important feature of this car. Because what this does is you may want sushi at 4:30 on Tuesday afternoons, but you yourself haven't realized that you want sushi at 4:30 on Tuesday afternoons. So at 4:25, this car syncs with your smartphone. It's read all your data. It's the most advanced predictive analytics software that Alibaba have been able to produce. It says to you, why don't you come to this restaurant for some sushi at 4:25? We can even drive you there. You just have to say yes. And then you say yes, you go for your sushi, whatever. And so when I asked why that was important, he said, because we can take people away from restaurants which take cash and move them to restaurants which take Alipay. And that is basically what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with kinds of predictive technology which not only understand what we might want, but more importantly than that, actually change what we might want. In Facebook's terms, they call it nudging. So Facebook in Facebook boardrooms, they talk about their curation feed, and they talk about nudging people. So, you got people that you understand, use your predictive data analytics, big data to understand this community of people, and then nudge them in different directions, right? And this is the same that Alibaba are doing, same Facebook are doing. And this is precisely how these apps function. And they are incredibly scary. And I think that it shows, these examples kind of come together to kind of show, Pokemon Go, people who know me laugh about how regularly I talk about Pokemon Go, but it is, again, an ideal example in a certain way, because it was a kind of testing how Google could move people around. It's owned by Niantic, who were a Google subsidiary at the time of developing it, and it's just nudging people around the city, basically. And this is what I'm really interested in, what I write about and what I talk about, is how we are being nudged by capitalism and by politics, and that nudging is happening because of desire. And so we need psychoanalysis more than ever, because psychoanalysis is the tool which helps us to understand how politics and culture affect us at the level of desire. And we are now a whole society of people, individuals, subjects who are being nudged in different directions. And it's a form of control. Yeah, I'm always not scared of sounding like some kind of hippie. Like, it is absolutely a form of control and a form of manipulation. Now, I don't obviously want us to go and live in a forest away from the internet. Absolutely not. I actually hate going outside. I hate the outdoors, and I'm on the computer all of the day. But I think it's incredibly scary that we are, a society of subjects whose desires are being transformed by politics and culture, which I don't in itself think is bad. I think our desires should be transformed by politics and culture, but they're being transformed by the wrong politics and cultures. And we are being nudged in the direction of hyper-capitalism, platform capitalism, and a reduction of political subversion, things like that. So that is me, and that is what my research is, really. It's using psychoanalysis to think about desire, both in the direct sense of love and desiring people and things, but also in a more abstract sense of like how our feelings, thoughts, impulses, desires are implicated in these kind of wider patterns of capitalism and political discourse, and how we're being sort of nudged around at the level of desire in quite dystopian ways. So hopefully that's a good summary.
yeah, cheerful. Someone asked the title of your incoming book. Do you want to say it? Oh
yeah. So at the moment, I actually finished writing it this week. It's called Dream Lovers. Dream Lovers, the gamification. I think it's going to be called Dream Lovers. Yeah, subtitles, I think, Capitalism and the Gamification of Relationships.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, it's I think it's fascinating, and of course it resonates, this idea that, okay, the algorithm or technology, these apps, they have a knowledge of us that is foreclosed to us. So they are this sort of subjects supposed to know somehow. And we rely a lot. I think this is very evident also, for instance, in all the health and body related app. So for instance, as a woman, I can definitely, I know, I'm perfectly aware that my cycle tracking apps know much more about my uterus, my estrogens, or whatever, than I do. So that sometimes the way I feel or how I relate, for instance, to my sexual life, etc., is, the app is definitely an actant that,
Yeah,
and also that asks a lot of things. And sometimes I'm like, no, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to tell you that. So I think that there is also this sense in which we sort of perceive that apps may know what we want, what we need. And there is also a sense in which we are kind of sometimes very annoyed or angry or frustrated when we don't get what we want. Like,
yeah, I wish I'd said just now you've said that. I wish I'd said when you mentioned that, when I was talking about Grindr, this point you make about the menstrual apps is really relevant, and also smart condoms, which is something I also quite enjoy just saying, because what a couple of words in a row that is. But smart condoms are this incredible thing by a British company where you sort of put this, probably shouldn't do any physical gestures actually to describe them. You put this on and it sort of gets the data from your sexual life, and similar with the menstrual tracking, and that's called intimate data. And that is actually why Donald Trump tried to get Grindr back. I didn't even finish the stupid anecdote about Grindr, but Donald Trump actually forced China to sell the app back to the US. So you had this kind of mad way in which this kind of misogynist, homophobic president is battling with this nation that doesn't even support gay rights to get hold of this gay dating app. You know, it's just, you couldn't write this stuff. But like, the fact is, the data, which is called intimate data, is so incredibly valuable that America wants it back from China, and they can put their politics aside because the data is valuable and they want that more than they care about, you know, anything else.
I think another thing that you said that interests me, and that perhaps it might relate in some ways to what Isabel is going to share with us, is this idea, okay, the apps know what we want, the algorithm, the artificial intelligence, I don't know what subject, how do we want to name this sort of agglomerate of subject, but anyways, there's something that knows what we want better than we do. And I think from what I've observed in interviewing people that have been using dating apps is that really do them, because people are incredibly frustrated that in fact we are not apps don't get us right. At least dating apps don't get us right. They keep on proposing something that we in fact and I think I'm fascinated exactly by these sort of affective dynamics, and now we get angry at apps, and now we get hopeful in relation to them. So and I tend to think about it also in terms of ethics, and perhaps the way Isabel think about ethics and AI is completely different, but yes, so I really would like to hear what you want to share with us, Isabel. So the floor is yours.
Sorry, you took me by surprise there, wasn't it? Thank you. Thanks, Carolina. That, it's really nice to be here. And Alfie, that was really interesting talk. And I hope that what I'm going to talk about kind of can sort of speak to what you're saying. But of course, I'm not a social scientist. I'm a sort of philosopher and a psychoanalytic theorist. So I don't have any empirical research that I can report back and tell you what I found, because actually my approach to AI is sort of much more conceptual, I suppose. And I suppose the empirical aspect of it is the fact that I was motivated by the kind of discourses around artificial intelligence, and the way that that artificial intelligence is kind of thought of as this monolithic thing that is out there, and that may be either a terrible apocalyptic force or alternatively some sort of utopic solution to humans' problems. So think of, for example, Elon Musk on the one hand and Ray Kurzweil on the other. And you know, both these figures sort of represent huge sort of phallic images of the forces behind thinking about artificial intelligence, both financially but also scientifically, and the kind of research that's going on around that. And the thing is, you know, we can kind of ignore it, but at the same time, it's quite terrifying to think that these are the people who have at the moment the most influence on the ways that the AI is actually really being developed. And yet on the other hand, we have all of the films and the fiction and the cinema and the literature around artificial intelligence, which is where our fantasies come from about AI and what we sort of imagine when we're thinking about these figures of cyborgs and robots and all of these filmic representations of the fully embodied artificial intelligence. So on the one hand, you have the sort of actual real life question of AI, and then you have the fiction question of AI. But from my perspective, what I felt was that there was a meeting point between these two worlds, which was both science and fiction. And I found the discourse that sort of merged these two sides was, of course, psychoanalysis, which is in a sense a discourse of science and of fiction. So my project, the Psychoanalysis of AI, which was my PhD and is the book that I've just written and which has just come out this month, I suppose what it tries to do first of all is transition from the sort of typical sort of philosophical question about AI of does it think, to the psychoanalytic question, which is does it enjoy? And of course, with saying that, one already asks, what do you mean by that? And what could you possibly mean when you're talking about the enjoyment of an AI? So in kind of posing the question already, I'm sort of begging the question of what a psychoanalysis of AI could possibly mean. Initially, I'm kind of sort of, in a sense, using the tools of philosophy, because I use the traditional philosophical Kantian questions, which are, as Carolina mentioned, the question of ethics is one of them, but that's just one aspect of it. So we have firstly, what can I know? Secondly, what should I do? And thirdly, what may I hope for? And then, of course, there's the fourth question, what is man? So these four questions sort of form the framework for how I approach the question of AI. But of course, I don't approach that in the typical Kantian way. I do it in the Lacanian way. And if any Lacanians are here in the chat, they may be familiar with Lacan's interview with Jacques-Alain Millar at Television, in which Millar asks him the Kantian questions because he's trying to sort of question Lacan about the value of psychoanalysis and what the point of it is. And Lacan famously says, well, it's not for the analyst to ask the Kantian questions, it's for the analyst to position the subject so that they can understand their disposition towards those questions. So in a sense, the book sort of similarly uses this these questions in a way to ask how we are implicated subjectively towards these questions. So I try and first of all build up three concepts in order to unpack how exactly I'm approaching this question, because it is quite a sort of a difficult task to bring the two sides together. And the three initial concepts that I use are the concept of intelligence, the concept of the object, and the question of sex. And firstly, we can think about intelligence in terms of human intelligence. And first of all, what we see very quickly is that we don't really have a very efficient way of talking about intelligence. And it's often a concept that is kind of overused and very under-theorized. And because we already don't understand how intelligence functions with humans, it seems a bit of a jump to already then start talking about artificial intelligence as if we could suddenly make some sort of model upon something that we already don't know how it works. So for this, I draw on the work of Catherine Malibu, who has written a book called Intelligence, in which she looks at the genealogy of the concept of intelligence and how this idea has changed and has huge amounts of literature surrounding it, and is not just a question of science, but it's a question of politics, of course. So interestingly, Catherine Malabou sort of identifies that in all the discourses around intelligence, one sort of blind spot that is often overlooked is the question of stupidity, which I found really interesting because sort of stupidity to me is a sort of mirror of a sort of Lacanian idea, which is the notion of negativity, which is the question of the subject. And this idea as well is something which these kind of proto-psychoanalytic ideas is a sort of theme that I found in a lot of critical theory surrounding the question of AI, themes such as failure, trauma, the Omega number, these questions that keep coming up when people are theorizing the question of artificial intelligence. So ultimately, it sort of led me to think about the characterization of psychoanalysis as an anti-philosophy. This phrase, the anti-philosophy, is for Lacan something which is not a sort of rejection of philosophy, but it's rather an interrogation of its formal structure and the question of the relationship of truth in relation to knowledge, which for Lacan is intimately related to the question of speech and the question of structure. So this is all to say that this is the question of structure in relation to sex. So with that, the next idea that I elaborate is the question of the object. And in psychoanalysis, the object is another fundamental psychoanalytic concept, which many people will be familiar with in terms of the object A, the object cause of desire, which is the structural, the structure of subjectivity, which allows the subject to desire. This is a sort of very well trodden concept within psychoanalysis, and of course most people will kind of be aware that it has been very, very well used by Zizek and all sort of Lacanian scholars who talk about desire in relation to capitalism, etc., etc. But another way that concept has been sort of unthought is through another idea that Lacan talks about in Seminar 17, which is the lathus. And this concept was another form of object that he saw as occurring at the intersection between science and capitalism. And these sort of technological objects that he saw emerging in the world were things that made him think about the different ways that the object might start to function in the future, even though he at the time was only talking about tape recorders because that was as far as the technology had gone for him. But actually what he was talking about conceptually has a huge resonance in relation to the way that we can start thinking about the relationship with AI and the drive and desire. So for example, rather than tape recorders, if we think about Neuralink and we think about microchips and we think about the ways that forms of technology can now be inserted into the brain. Of course, we don't have it yet, but these kind of things are already being developed, and we don't know how they're going to affect the ways that we form our regimes with resonance. We don't know how the drive is going to be affected by these kinds of technologies. So the next concept that I come to is, of course, the sexual non-rapport, which is for Lacan this phrase that is bandied about all the time, and people sort of may or may not be familiar with it, but ultimately it's a reference to the different antagonistic forms of enjoyment or jouissance that characterize masculine and feminine forms of enjoyment, and that are what every subject of speech is a product of, merely because of the fact that we speak. All of these concepts build up for me into the central figure, which is of course the sex bot, which is the figure that I use to analyze the Kantian questions from a psychoanalytic perspective. And why? Because this figure is for me the sort of vanishing mediator between, on the one hand, AI, and on the other hand, psychoanalysis, and the ways in which structurally enjoyment and knowledge are connected via this figure, this non-human figure. Because ultimately, what I've tried to do is to show that actually the way that we talk about AI doesn't need necessarily a new discourse. It's already within the component parts of psychoanalysis, allow us to talk about the question of the unconscious, the question of the speaking body, and all of these other questions of subjectivity that psychoanalysis allows us to think. Because contrary to what most people think, psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis at least, is not a humanism. It's a discourse that actually shows us the ways in which the human is split between, a very inhuman system of symbolic system of combinatorial machinic processes, and a sort of almost undead form of enjoyment. And in a sense, these are not human ideas, and that's why I try to show the ways in which psychoanalysis allows us to think about AI in a way that's actually much more human, but in a psychoanalytic sense human, rather than in a sort of normative sense. So moving to the sort of Kantian questions, the first one, what can I know, is for me the way that we can start to think about the structural relationship to knowledge in terms of sexuation. And I don't know if people are familiar with the Turing test, but of course the Turing test was the initial test developed by Alan Turing in order to try and discern whether you could fool somebody into thinking that an AI or a machine was sentient by virtue of the linguistic interactions. And one of the lesser known things about the Turing test is that actually one of the things that it had to do was to convince one of the interlocutors that it was of a different gender. And this was very ironic, this idea of wearing drag in order to sort of convince your partner, because of course Alan Turing was chemically castrated, because being homosexual was a crime at the time, and he killed himself. So this idea of gender being intimately related to the question of discerning somebody's consciousness, to me, was extremely psychoanalytic, and which is why I found the film, for example, Ex Machina, a very elegant way of depicting the question of the Turing test not in terms of can I discern whether you're conscious, but can I discern whether you're a woman, which is basically what happens between the male and the female protagonists in that film. And if we think about Joan Kopiec and her uses of the Kantian antinomies and the way that she maps on Kant's antinomies to Lacan's graphs of sexuation, and finds that the dynamical and the mathematical antinomies would mirror the masculine and feminine sides of the graphs of sexuation, we can see how we can think about that in terms of the question of knowledge in relation to structure in terms of the Turing test. So that's my sort of first question in terms of the epistemology and the question of knowledge in relation to artificial intelligence. The next question, of course, is the ethical question, and the question, what should I do? Which for Lacan, the question of ethics is different from basically any other discourse when it comes to ethics, because it's a very different discourse than a discourse of philosophical morality. For Lacan, ethics is to do with desire, so much so that he reads famously in his Kant avec Sade paper, he reads the Marquis de Sade as the sort of ultimate Kantian, in the sense that his formal system of morality was absolutely following the logic, the structural logic of the Kantian ethics to the nth degree. And he found that actually Kant wasn't a good enough Kantian, but Sade was the truth of Kant. So this idea of the ethics of psychoanalysis in relation to AI, I found interestingly in relation to the female body as something which could be thought of in terms of finding a form of ultimate enjoyment and what it would mean to have a body of ultimate enjoyment, which, for example, in the Marquis de Sade, of course, he depicts in very gruesome and horrific ways in relation to young women who are sort of retrained through brutal sexual exploits, but to the point that they achieve this most ecstatic and wonderful form of enjoyment. And the point about for Sade was that the libertines in his stories were, in a sense, frustrated because they were never able to reach this ultimate form of enjoyment, because they were already always frustrated by the sort of normal cycles of you know, the human body, that you can't just keep coming and coming and coming. Eventually you will stop and fall asleep, or you can't just keep doing something violent and brutal because you will die, you know. So very obviously the human body stops you from achieving this beyond state of undead pleasure. So of course we can see a sort of iteration, and many iterations of that, in depictions of female bodies, in human female bodies, of artificially intelligent female bodies. In the book I use for this example Ghost in the Shell, which is not a particularly brutal film, but it allows us to think about the question of the human body as the female body as a weapon, as a pure weapon of kind of absolute undead expenditure. So this question of ethics, to me, was something that was very relevant in terms of thinking about how our fantasies of the female body are not just sort of contingent male fantasies that happen in cinema, but actually there was something structurally important about the way that femininity was projected into form. The third Kantian question, of course, is the question, what may I hope for? And for me, in terms of AI, that was a question of reproduction, and the question of reproduction in relation to replication, which is something that for psychoanalysis is sort of essential in terms of thinking about how subjectivity is structured and how we orient ourselves towards our lost object, which of course, psychoanalysis, we talk about castration, and we talk about the forms of psychic structure that are a product of supposedly the negotiation of the Oedipal complex, etc., etc. Now, for the question, when we starting to talk about cloning and starting to talk about replication, we're getting to very different territory about how this relates to the question of this lost object. So for this film, for this chapter, I explore the film Blade Runner 2049, which is of course about the question of replication and how we should start thinking about if we are able to reproduce humans without biology, in a sense, then what would that mean for the regimes of subjective structure and enjoyment? But actually that film is actually pretty much a conservative film, which all it does is replicate the sort of standard way of understanding human relationships anyway, because all of the female replicants gestate, supposedly that's what happens to them, and their ability to procreate, in a sense, does not escape the sort of very conservative ideas about male and female subjectivity. But I think what was interesting for me sort of depicted through the main character, Ryan Gosling's character's sort of search for his identity and his constant, you know, searching for this question of whether he was born or whether he was a product of gestating mother. And you know, what does he do in order to find this question out? He goes through various different feminine characters that allow him to basically find his masculinity. A very sort of classic masculine figure, a very classic filmic trope. But ultimately, we're still left with the question of what is this child that is being looked for. All that to say is that the book ends on the question of the child and on the question of the sort of futurity of this problem of replication. And I think what I'll do is leave it there, because I think I've spoken for 15 minutes, and maybe we can go into some of the specifics afterwards. But
thank you very much. I think that well, you said so many things, so it's really a good teaser to go and actually engage with these important questions by reading your book, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. I think from what you said, there's something very important, and it emerged also in our first dialogue of the Summer of Love with Mark Durs and Anya Malinowska, that may be within the audience today, which is the question of the body, and how, technology or AI, but even just dating apps, in a sense, dating apps. Hi, Anya, I can see, yes, you're here. I'm very happy that you're here. So the question of the body, and for instance, what I'm observing in doing this small-scale qualitative research that I'm doing is that dating apps, and also especially niche dating apps, sorry, Isabel, because you at some point you froze, so I didn't know if it was my problem, your problem. Anyways, they are sort of technologies for engaging with one's fantasy and desire in a disembodied way. So providing a space for fantasy that is disembodied, but that is also active. So in empirical terms, I'm talking to people that are telling me how dating apps and erotic apps, in a sense, apps that have to do with sex and desire, play quite a fundamental role in their socialization as erotic subjects, or in the discovery of what they like, what they desire. So I think, but it is all disembodied in a sense. So I think that the question of the body remains. I mean, the more I reflect on these topics, the more the question of the body somehow keep coming at the forefront, and it is a very difficult question. So now, what I'd like to do is to, if you'd like to, I'd like to turn this into a seminar, so sort of transforming the attendees into panelists in their own right. And this session is recorded, so if you don't want to be visible, then turn your camera off. But if you want to be visible, I think it's much appreciated, so that we can have the impression, or actually we can have a collective conversation and use this affordance to enable us to have this feeling of many people talking about something. And I've seen that there are a few familiar faces and familiar names in the audience, as well as people that I haven't met yet. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. Please feel free to turn your camera on and just be with us as if we were in a very big room with some spritz. And in the meantime, I would like to ask, I think this is a question perhaps more for Alfie, but anyways, I'll ask to everybody. It's from an anonymous attendee, and it says, I know conceptualization of privacy are vastly different across different cultures and even within national cultures. So nudging might appear scary to some, nudging might also be seen as making use of technology to make life easier for others. So how does one find balance between technology making life easier and perhaps technology imposing on what one considers private? I think this is a very important question, also from the point of view of social science, social scientists. So yeah, I don't know if Alfie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I read the question as well. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question as well. I think so. So I think we do need probably to. I guess my answer is we probably need to move away or add to at least debates about privacy and security, because I suppose there's obviously, as I'm sure you all know, massive amount of work on how dangerous and risky these apps are from the perspective of surveillance and privacy. So I guess I'm less interested in the way in which they know who we are, and more interested in the way in which they tell us who to become. So I think there's something extra is needed in this kind of these discussions. It's not about I'm not so interested in whether we should protect privacy. I know that sounds like a sort of maybe flippant and maybe silly thing to say, but I think that there's no way back on that point. I don't think so. I'd certainly take the point that some people would find the concept of nudging, for example, quite palatable rather than dystopian. So I personally, my position is I absolutely accept that the machines will understand everything about us, every location we've ever gone to, everything we've ever eaten, thought, felt, and I don't care. What I do care about is who owns the machines and what they're used to do, and how they're used to influence us. So I think that we should maybe drop some of the idea of protecting ourselves from surveillance and the machines, and start fighting a different set of battles about who owns these machines. Why is it 1% of people in Silicon Valley and their affiliates and not larger collaborative ownership models? And what are they being done, what are they being used to do, right? Who are they trying to turn us into? When it's just Alibaba who own the machines and they just want us to go and use Alipay rather than supporting a business that has cash, then clearly this is an outcome we collectively might want to resist, right? So I think the solution, I hope that makes sense. The solution is not in, I think privacy tools are very important for certain things and we should use them. But another solution is that to accept that the future does involve us, being understood by computers, but battling instead over the ownership of those machines and computers and what they're being used for.
Thank you. Nate.
Well, that was super quick. I just want to say thanks to both the speakers. I thought they were super interesting presentations, and I have a question for each of you. First of all, for Isabel, I thought, it's very fascinating, and I guess your emphasis on ethics, of course, is if I think about the kind of discourse around AI coming from arts and social sciences, very broadly conceived, ethics is one of the main areas of intervention, let's say, but it's a very, very different type of ethics, right? It's ethics around privacy, it's ethics around things like discrimination, bias, and so on. And I think by putting, by coming through a psychoanalytic framework and stressing kind of questions around desire and pathology and so on, it's a completely different angle, and it's one I think from within psychoanalysis, it would be very familiar. So from people who are, let's say, who are already on board with your kind of general approach, they would be very sympathetic. But I guess my question for you is, how, where do you see your work kind of contributing to those other discourses in AI, right? Like let's say the very mainstream discourses, the discourses say, of the Alan Turing Institute and the approach to ethics that you see coming out of those spaces, which I think are quite different. So, you know, I don't want to say it's a question about like impact, but a question about like what kind of spaces do you see your work kind of going in? Because I think within psychoanalysis, I think, you know, is one thing, but then moving outside poses a whole set of other questions that I think maybe are more interesting. And then my question for Alfie is around nudging. And, you know, I'm sure that people in the UK are very familiar with the history of nudging and its kind of success moving up to levels of government with the nudge, you know, the Behavioral Insights Unit, and are familiar with that history of, let's say, the long arc of behavioral economics moving to a kind of to an influential register in public discussion. What I thought was really interesting is, you know, the critiques that you often hear about nudging are political critiques. So critiques that, you know, for example, around paternalistic liberalism. I think Nick Gain kind of recently did a kind of historical overview of that in Theory, Culture and Society, but those debates have kind of, you know, played out. And it's a critique of nudge at the level of politics and perhaps political economy. But I think it's perhaps a more interesting approach to take a psychoanalytic perspective. And of course, one of the things that nudging has kind of built up is a kind of problematic actor, right? It's not the rational actor, but it's also, it's let's say it's not the psychoanalytic actor either. It's a kind of, it's a different, so it's the person who can be guided and shaped, but you still have in nudge, if you think about the way that nudge plays out, say in apps or in architectures, they talk about choice architecture, right? So, you know, choice is the thing that the rational actor does, but the architecture as the behavioral component, and you know, it's this weird kind of odd meeting of the two. And I think a psychoanalytic approach is very well positioned to kind of show, you know, a different take on it. But the question that I had, sorry, this is like two big questions, but I'm going somewhere with them, is, you know, when you spoke about, you know, the drive as being like the kick up the arse, as opposed to instinct, I kind of wonder, like, if we think about nudge, is nudge in your account, is it the kick up the arse, or is it that you've already been kicked up the arse and the nudge is just directing kind of where you go after you've been kicked? Because I think they're two different things, but I think that could be the space where you think about, you know, these questions in terms of psychoanalysis. I'll leave it there. Two big questions, sorry.
I'll let Isabel answer first.
So sorry, just to clarify, you're asking, where do I see the impact of my research? Is that what you're?
No, I'll put it in really simple terms.
Yeah.
Is, given the discussion around AI and ethics is largely around privacy, bias, discrimination, but your work is coming from a very, very different space. And what can you see that work do? Do you want to have a discussion with that other form of AI and ethics? Like, do you see your work moving beyond psychoanalysis and kind of, you know, psychoanalytic discussions and the kind of the disciplinary space of psychoanalysis?
Yes, I mean, well, the in a sense, it is already an interdisciplinary project by definition. I mean, it's psychoanalysis, but it's theory, and it's intervenes in philosophy and aesthetics and film theory and various different discourses, and also, you know, yes, it's sort of the normative ethics of artificial intelligence do sort of enter into the conversation, but essentially I think any work of theory, it's difficult for something that is by definition very abstract to kind of intervene in the everyday space of for example AI ethics. And I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, but at the same time, you know, people working in AI in the sort of much more practical side of it, and more the questions of the technical aspects of AI, are interested in these questions, and they have been kind of trying to be in dialogue with these kinds of things. But I don't really think that it's I don't really think that the theory can necessarily set out to have a practical impact, because if you set out to do that, then you're kind of already on the wrong track, because then you're doing social science. And it's nice if these things do have impact, but the impact can only happen through people reading books and through thinking about questions and ideas. And if those questions and ideas filter out to other people, brilliant. If they don't, they don't. And it's not a question of like going and giving TED Talks to people in AI and trying to tell them how they should be thinking about AI. I mean, for example, a sort of very practical example of where these things meet is I'll be doing a project with Idabot, who is the world's first humanoid artist, and she is currently a project in the world that people are interested in and questioning. How does this notion of the subjectless artist create a conversation around AI and around how we think about consciousness and psychoanalysis, etc., etc. And I'll be talking to those people about how this actually affects the world. But in a sense, these meetings are great that they happen, but whether they actually do the work of theory is another question. All they can do is open up spaces for thinking about things which are ultimately so complicated and so unknown that probably the best places where we can talk about these things are in things like cinema and literature, because they're unthought. They're things that we haven't necessarily been able to anticipate yet. So in a sense, yes, I do think that it would be great if these conversations opened up into actual AI research, but I don't hold out much hope that Ray Kurzweil is going to go and buy my book, to be honest.
Thank you. Alfie.
Okay. So I mean, so this is, I mean, I suppose what I'd like to do with your question is not answer it, but kind of apply it to the love industry, I guess, because I think this is a good idea. I mean, I don't know, like your question, I thought the fun part is are you being sort of, have you already been driven in one direction? Have you already had the, as it were, the Lacanian drive, and then the nudging? So you're like just sort of, you've already been kicked in the arse. You're just kind of flying through space, and this process is just nudging you in a little bit to one way or the other where you might land, or is nudging an actual, a kick in the ass itself. I think that's a really good way of thinking about this in the history of love. And I guess like some of the people that I have found important, which I didn't really mention, but I'm sure like well known to many people here. No, I've seen Carolina and also Anya talk about these kind of people like Eva Illouz and also a book by Nicholas Luhmann called Lover's Passion, The Codification of Love, which is pretty old now, older than me even, which, it talks, and those kind of, and also I guess even like people like Shulmei Firestone and stuff, talking about how there's this extremely long history of codifying love. And Luhmann's book is really cool because it's like, well, the codification of love sounds like a title about how love and algorithms come together, but it's not. It's a book from before we had the internet, which is talking about how literature took over from the family and religion as the thing which set the codes for being in love in contemporary society. So, I think what we probably need to do is update those ideas for the actual concrete digital world of algorithms and data, and say that we had let's say in this really oversimplified way, religion and the church, institutions of marriage, codifying love, followed by literature, followed by cinema, and now the new codification of love comes from these kind of applications which happen to actually use something called code, but they then edit in this long history. So as it were, to put that in terms of your question, Nate, I think yes, you've already been kicked from the whole history of codifying love, and you've already been taught how to love and why to love and what to do with your desires, and you're being so you've already been sent by ideology down a particular path, but we're now seeing that changed again. And yeah, it's not just perhaps a gentle nudge, but we're seeing quite radical changes to the way we love and desire. But also, and this is part of the problem, these applications, they inherit the problems of that long history of codifying love. They inherit its patriarchies, its class prejudices, its racial prejudices, which we were kicked down that path long ago. But these new processes are, I think, an opportunity to nudge us in a better direction, which are unfortunately nudging us in an even worse one, I suppose would be my answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With Alberto Cosso, who's here, we are reflecting, trying to theorize about these dialectics between existing romantic cultures and their digital remediations, and how these codes, there is a recoding, or what are the new codes that are produced? Because of course there is a sense in which the app tells you, oh, I know what you want, and I'll make it easier. And this is a very face value. But then if you go, at least in my experience as a researcher, if you go and look for what happens, this is not exactly the case. And there is this sort of negotiation, a process of negotiation within what the subject thinks they desire and what they think the app can give them. So there's a complex web between this choice and architecture, to use Nate's word. And I know that Sergio and Anya have questions. So I think that Sergio was first to raise his hands and then Anya. Hi, Sergio. Welcome back.
Oh, hi, Sergio. Good to see you all the way from Mexico. How are you?
Hi to all of you. Thank you for both presentations. My question is simple. What do you think are the clinical implications of your work in psychoanalytic clinic? Because that's the question, but I would like to explain why I am asking this. Because it's very important to understand, I believe, that when you go through the experience of psychoanalysis, you understand the theoretical foundations, both of Freud or Lacan, in a particular way. And I believe that the question of the clinic should be addressed here more often, especially when you, as an analyst, as an analysant, or as you, because I am an analysant, or as you hear from psychoanalysts, that they face these challenges that from the cell phones or from Zoom meetings and from the new exploitation of work through home office and that stuff. I mean, all of the topics that you were discussing, I agree that they are urgent to discuss. We need to discuss them. But what I was missing in your presentations was the clinical dimension of this. And I believe that in order to truly discuss psychoanalysis, we should address that question. I know that we can differentiate between clinical psychoanalytic research and a theoretical research, but I believe that we cannot work like if they are totally different things, or that the implications we assume or conclude from one of these areas do not impact on the ways we understand the other areas. So that's the question. What do you see is the influence and the consequences on your research and from your research into the clinical area of psychoanalysis?
Thank you, Sergio. I'd like to hear also from Anya, and I want to anticipate you that we're going to run a bit out of time because we're cool. Anya.
Okay, thank you so much, Carolina. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Alfie. It's a great pleasure to meet you finally. And those talks, I mean, they were amazing. Thank you so much. We've taken notes. My questions to you are going to be provocations. I will start with Alfie because it's actually it's the same. There will be two questions, but about the same thing. Alfie, you mentioned that you accept that at some point we will be like perfectly understood by computers in terms of like how we feel, what we like, etc., etc. And I agree with you absolutely. Emotional data is a kind of is going to be like a holy grail and the new thing. It's going to be the new data, the kind of the gold of the future. So it was like a perfect question. But my question is, what does it mean? What does it mean to be understood by computers in terms of like, or just being aware of the fact that the data is being very much filtered by ideas, by the very idea what emotion is and what cognition is and what sentient is. We know that, what the cues, the emotional cues that computers receive are just the reflection of our like limited understanding of our own emotions. We know that emotions are like, or feelings are a very new invention. So it's a one thing, but also I'm thinking, and this is what I've been thinking throughout, the entire presentation of Isabel. By the way, I mean, I find your book fascinating. It's like the first thing on my reading list. That we have no idea what kind of cognition and sentience AI, when it like goes off script and becomes independent, autonomous, develops. It might be something very, very different when we assume that that it's a parallel intelligence, as many claim. So this is my Alfie. What does it mean to be understood by computers? What do you think about it? And to Isabel, how does the psychoanalytical perception of pleasure, which is like very human oriented, which is applicable to the human understanding of pleasure, can be applicable to AI? I haven't read your book, so perhaps like it's a futile question, but I think it's important.
Thank you, Sergio and Anya. And Anya, by the way, that mirror is amazing. It looks so good.
Thank you.
Because style is important after all. Let's make it clear. I'm wearing lipsticks only for these events. Right. Alfie and Isabel, and then I know that Sarah Safai has a question, and I'm looking forward also to hear from her. So we are going to go a bit out of time because this is what glamorous panels do. I don't know, Alfie, Isabel, whoever wants to go first.
Do you want to go ahead, Isabel?
Thank you for those questions. My internet connection is a bit rubbish, so it's sort of coming in and out, but I think I kind of got the scope of the questions. So Sergio, you were asking about the clinical implications of these questions and these interventions. I mean, first of all, this is sort of one of the central issues, of course, always when you're talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis, is the question of the clinic versus theory, and the question of the actual subject of the analysand and the relation, the transference relationship, and all of these questions, which of course are never going to be the same as when you're talking about abstract conceptual usages of psychoanalytic concepts. I mean, they're never going to be the same anyway when you're talking about philosophy and the human realm, but let alone when you're talking about artificial intelligence and sort of concepts that aim to draw on the tools of psychoanalysis in order to try and conceptualize other sort of forms of thinking. And absolutely, the clinic, for me anyway, is essential in thinking about the actual question of jouissance and the question of the material of psychoanalysis and speech and the body and subjectivity. And my actual sort of training in psychoanalysis was through clinicians and actual practicing psychoanalysts who were, you know, the clinic was their only reference point, and of course to me that it was essential to understand it from that point of view. But I think that we're dealing with very different questions, and of course, you know, as soon as you start talking about the relationship between an analyst and an analyst, you're in a different ethical realm. But having said that, you know, lots of the book is influenced by trying to use actually the later Lacan and some of the appropriations of it by the Millarian clinic, and the question of ordinary psychosis and the question of autism, and looking at those questions sort of conceptually in a way that tries to explore them a bit more sort of in the political and philosophical realm as opposed to the clinical. But as I said, you know, it's always difficult to reconcile psychoanalytic discourse as a discourse of the one by one with any sort of universalizing discourse about the world or ethics or philosophy. So that would be my answer. I hope that sort of addresses what you were getting at. Shall I answer Anya's question, or should I? So Anya, thanks so much for that question. And you kind of dropped out at the end, so I think it was you were asking about the forms of. Can you just repeat the very last bit that you said? Because
yeah, so my question is, you know, how is the human idea of pleasure applicable to AI? Because, you know, this is what of course, you know, I understand like the premise of your research, and I've quickly read the description of your book, but, you know, it's a very a basic question. How this is what you do. You kind of the question you ask, the transition you mark. Yes. So it is very interesting. So we are not longer just kind of, you know, asking about AI. Does it think, but does it like experience pleasure? But you know, my question is like, this is what has been bothering me throughout the entire a debate around, also like ethical debate about AI, is whether like psychoanalysis operates by like a very specific understanding of pleasure, which is applicable to humans and comes from the human understanding of pleasure and the human experience of pleasure. So how that can be like applicable to the understanding of AI's pleasure, robots' pleasure. This is what like bothers me. And yeah, so
okay, well, that clears it up. I mean, what first thing I'd say is actually I very scarcely mention the word pleasure at all, because actually for psychoanalysis, enjoyment or jouissance is really a sort of paradoxical concept that isn't really necessarily pleasure. And I think it would be even better to call it suffering, in fact, rather than pleasure, or any sort of question of pleasure and pain. Ultimately is a paradoxical one that is the kind of meat, as it were, of psychoanalysis. So of course, you know, my interest in the book is really not to try and talk about do artificial intelligences experience pleasure. That would be the wrong way of posing the question. It's more to do with looking at the relationship of structure in terms of how we think about AI. And structure is really the first starting point from any sort of psychoanalytic intervention, as opposed to a sort of question of thinking about the conscious subject. We're talking about a split subject, a body and a speaking being, a speaking being, and a question of formulaic systems. Okay, but essentially the book is not about machines, and it's about the idea of, when we're talking about AI, how is the question of psychoanalytic structure inherently implicated in the ways that AI is thought about and the AI is developed. So once you start thinking about it more in terms of a sort of not a question of an affect, but rather a question of a formal system, then it's more about trying to understand how to approach AI rather than trying to impose human ways of thinking about things. Because my whole point really is that psychoanalysis is not humanism. Psychoanalysis is not about emotions in a sense. It's actually an anti-philosophy. So I think that kind of gets to your point. I hope that.
Absolutely. I just, like I said, my question was about to be a provocation to kind of clarify.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a good question because it's an obvious one that people ask, and I think you're right to ask it. Yeah.
And I once had a nice conversation with Eugene Tucker in which we discussed like the depression of robots. It's which comes from the fact that this is where the design is going. Affective computing is just kind of headed now. So like, not only should the machine be able to kind of like emulate pleasurable or enjoyment, but also just like pain and suffering. So it's kind of, soon perhaps like AI will be the patients. I'm just joking because of course it won't. I'm just kind of joking, but this is kind of like where the projection is headed for. Thank you so much.
No, I think that's really interesting. I think it's a really good answer as well. I agree with Izzy, I think, for the most part. I think with Sergio's question, I was also just sort of thinking, I mean, I am not a clinician in psychoanalysis, but I think that, this is clearly like, I mean, we recently I talked recently with Ian Parker, who is a psychoanalyst clinician about this. And, clearly these changes are going to mean that, that there's going to have to be changes at the level of actual psychoanalytic practice, because, when you're talking about relationships with people and things, those kind of coordinates have completely changed, and a lot of the kind of affects that we traditionally, let's say, would get from engagement with other human beings have been sort of outsourced to machines, so the question of the subjects in relation to those kind of points of contact which kind of provide it with its daily narcissism are massively and dramatically different. So what in other ways, Sergio, what is couples therapy in psychoanalysis going to do when only one of the people in the couple is a human in the traditional sense? It's clearly going to require a lot of thinking through, and it's probably not for me to do it, but clearly there's going to be some interesting changes on that front. And as for Annie, your question, I don't know, are you sort of saying that, like, I don't know if I quite understood it right, but were you sort of saying that, like, in a sense, these computers don't learn the real us, they only learn the us that we think we know?
Yeah, but also datafy, so like, for instance, like the data for my preference, when even when we go to OkCupid and there is the list that defines like me as a kind of a person. Sorry about that. Me as a person.
Very traditional ringtone.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. My sister. So it just kind of the outline of a person I am is actually the outline of a persona. Yeah. But also I'm thinking about how when we think about a variety of wearables that try to just kind of even like take our emotional and physical cues that are being turned into database that will be just like used or is being used now for instance, for haptic devices and for romantic purposes and teledildonics, you name it. It's still like a very, very inadequate reflection of what feelings, body performance are in general. When you think about like the cultural history of feeling on the one hand, and the still like the primitive capacities of those devices and intelligences. I mean, when it comes to artificial intelligence, except for computationality, it's very primitive, apparently. It's like very, very simple. It's something with extraordinary computationality, but it's not the only form of intelligence. So this is what I'm, but also I'm just fascinated with the fact that I study glitches, and I believe that glitches are the manifestation of AI's real intelligence or subjecthood or robothood, you name it. When they go off script and start to like organize themselves and not in a kind of any like dangerous way, but their own way. So it's like an idea of what this intelligence might be really like. And so this is what fascinates me. Like the question is like what their actual understanding of us might be, because the understanding the data is just a human concept again. So that was, I wanted to kind of, just like.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, this is the stuff of the future. I mean, I don't know the answer, nobody does, but I think that's right. And I guess I would say also that, like, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in this kind of formulation is not so much like this is only what the idea that this is only one version of me, like, for instance, these old ideas of my Facebook profile is this kind of datafied abstraction of who I am, or whatever, but actually from the perspective of others, I think it becomes quite psychoanalytically interesting, like from the perspective of not the person who's creating the profile, but like it's entirely possible to spend an enormous amount of time engaging only with these datafied abstractions of people, and it becomes difficult sometimes to know whether you're actually enjoying the contact you're having with the person on the other end of the messages, or whether you're actually engaging more with the medium, the actual app itself. And people, I think in your article, Carolina, you also discussed this kind of thing where people stop actually thinking about this as a device which connects two people and start experiencing it as a relationship between themselves and the medium itself. And so this is actually, this is another part of that, why psychoanalysis would have to deal with your question, I guess, Anya, because it wouldn't just be about the subject that you're always, it's the other subjects that engage with your data subjectivity and stuff like that, and what that means for them and so on. So it's mad stuff, but it's also fun
stuff. I like feel like this is a very nice quote, and I know that Sarah, do you want to contribute? I know that Sarah is working.
Hi. Oh, actually, I tried to turn on my video. Hello. Hi, everyone. I really wanted to meet you and turn on my video, but I don't know. I'm using my phone and there's a weird setting. And also I'm one step away from being in my pajamas, so it's probably a good thing. So yeah, actually, I think the conversation that just happened just now just went in the direction of what I was thinking about as well, which is, Carolina, you made this comment about the body, and then you were using the term disembodied. And I just really think that the question of the body is so much at the heart of the discussion. And I was also thinking about the kind of data double, or that kind of digital persona, and how you have to navigate social interactions. And of course, like one of the main differences between a clinical setting and psychoanalysis in a clinical setting, and then using it as a theoretical methodology or hermeneutic tool, is that in the clinical setting, partly what the analyst is doing is interpreting the body and reading the body. So I definitely think there are clearly some ways in which the body is stripped out or being disembodied, but in the same time there's a sort, I think one of the challenges is actually understanding how we're being re-embodied, or what's going on with our affect. So even, for example, boredom or disinterest would be, that's one of the ways we have to reinterpret the body. But then I can't help but think that it kind of takes you down the route of governmentality the minute you start thinking about that persona, and the route of basically how the possibility of social relationships are becoming more and more constrained by the ways in which they're being mediated, because the emphasis always ends up being placed back on the individual as a quote unquote subject of communication. So it's not really a question or a comment. I just wanted to say hello and thank you very much for the presentations, and it's nice to hear about some of your work. So thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Actually, yes, I hope to see you also in our forthcoming events, because Sarah has written very inspiring things. Your article on Tinder is very good, I think.
Oh, thank you.
And the way you write is super good. Well, we need to talk about it at some point.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we are 15 minutes fashionably late, but if you have some comments or you want to respond on Sarah's questions, then I won't stop you, actually.
No, I'm just happy to admit that questions of the body are not something I've had enough time to think through in all this. You know, it does come up, especially with discussions of virtual reality and how this kind of questions of embodiment go. I suppose, yeah, I don't know about you, Izzy, but as someone who hates their body and would rather just get rid of it entirely, I always kind of shy away from these kind of debates.
One of my interviewees recently defined the body as this big inconvenience.
Yeah.
It's a very, very nice way of putting it. As far as I'm concerned, all the time I sort of reach a point in which I say, there is the question of the body, and that's all. That's all I have to say somehow. It's a difficult question, but there's a way in which a disembodied relationship with desire and with the other and with sex is kind of very much present. Not for the first time, arguably, right? But
I guess I will say that, like, I did some pretty strange research into VR pornography, and I think this idea of inhabiting another man's kind of virile body in some of these VR headsets is frightening and utterly bizarre from a psychoanalytic perspective. I did have a go on some pretty strange VR products in that area.
I think the body is exactly right. It's completely central to this debate, and actually, you know, I think people underestimate how much psychoanalysis is a discourse of the body, and that Lacan was a theorist of the body, and certainly to think about his later work and the question of the parler and the speaking body. This is really where it becomes much more apparent that what he's talking about most of the time is actually not just the typical thinking of psychoanalysis as a question of linguistics, but a question of really the body and how the body figures in relation to all the lost objects that fall from the body. And you know, of course, Lacan adds the scopic and the invocatory object to Freud's oral and anal objects, and these objects are objects that really do figure in our thinking about artificial intelligence and should be thought about in relation to artificial intelligence. And I think one of the important things to think about as well in terms of the fantasy of the wholeness of the embodied AI is it involves a sort of a kind of sleight of hand of trying to imagine this spherical being, which was another thing that Lacan didn't like about the way that philosophy often thought about the human, was that it imagined it as this one whole spherical being, which actually for psychoanalysis, it never is that. It's a collection of sort of dislocated and uncoordinated parts. So you're exactly right that I think the body is a very underthought question in relation to these issues.
thank you. So shall we say goodbye with this question of the body again, and then perhaps by the time that, I don't know, and September has come, we'll have some sort of shared elements to start thinking about the body. What you wrote on the chart, Anya, this neutral sex, I think it's very interesting, because what I'm finding is that this idea of a disembodied sexuality, of a disembodied desire, it's sort of part and parcel of a culture that tends to sterilize sexuality and to sterilize the body and to sort of also de-dramatize and de-romanticize, but there is a sense in which there is a sterilization of sexuality. Also, if you think about how magazines such as Cosmopolitan or Vogue, they talk about sexual practices such as anal sex or pegging, like sexual practices that were traditionally considered niche or kink. Yes, they are made mainstream, but in this making of them mainstream, there is also this sanitization. Like the first thing about anal sex is cut your nails, which, I mean, fair enough, but there is a sense in which there's this sort of yes, sanitization. So and arguably after a year of masks and gels and this body of the other as this risky thing that perhaps today we are even more into that thing, or perhaps not. Who knows? Perhaps we can keep on talking about it next week, because our next event is next week. We have on Thursday from 10 a.m. So bring cup of coffee and croissant, and we'll be with Belinda Middlewick from Sydney, the University of Sydney, and Kate Devlin from King's College, and we are getting to the stuff, sex and robots. So we're going around this issue now. Next Thursday morning, we really, hit this topic. So I hope to see you or some of you there. And thanks everybody. Thanks to also Greta and Alberto who kept their camera on. I really appreciated. It was nice to see some names also from the other time, like Alvaro, and then of course Sarah. So I hope to see as many of you as possible next Thursday to talk about sex and robots, because what else would you want to do next Thursday morning at 10? No? Right. So thank you very much.
Thank
Hope
you
to see you
so
soon.
much.
I'm already missing you all.
Thank you guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Carolina.